All right, welcome to a very special holiday edition of Heavy Hands, by which I mean one of the most slapdash, slipshod editions of the show all year long, as Phil and I both try to work around holiday plans and the internet at Phil's mom's house. Phil, in 10 seconds for after this sentence is done, I would like to find out how you are doing.
I'm doing pretty well. Oh, wait, we're not talking over each other. Yes. Okay. Bonus. Yeah.
Oh, no.
No, it's something of a meme on the show that my internet is terrible, and this is obviously way, way worse.
Yeah, so if you ever, after this date, feel like complaining about Phil's connection, just be thankful. It's not, what do you call your dad, Phil? Do you say dad over there?
Pater. Mater and Pater.
So be grateful it's not Phil's mom and Pater. So let's see. Today we are going to be talking about the fights that happened last weekend. All of this, of course, is just wasting time in anticipation of next week's episode, which, if you've listened to this show for more than a year, you know is the highly anticipated, always exciting, the annual handies. Phil and I will be giving out several handies, and while we will not look one another in the eye for weeks afterwards, it's always a process worth going through. So we're going to be selecting our bests of the year, and Phil, I think, was probably the thing that gave me the most comfort after bringing you on to replace that traitorous bastard Patrick Wyman. Were all of the wonderful categories you brought to the handies last year. So I'm expecting some more ridiculously absurd and slightly offensive superlatives for this year as well.
I mean, we definitely got to bring back best brain thinking in a fight and most unintentionally hilarious fighter, whatever that particular one was called specifically, because those were two of my favorites. But I think we can definitely think of a few more. The one thing I just think is that, as with, the heavy bag, I think we do need a protracted handy sound effect.
Well, I got a jar of mayonnaise in the cabinet upstairs. I think I could probably make something that sounds about what you're thinking of. Should I go grab it?
Perhaps not.
Okay. All right.
For the time being.
Okay. All right. Well, let's just go ahead and dive in. What we really want to talk about today, or last weekend's fights, Frankie Edgar versus Korean Zombie. After 2019 just being a year of me getting all my predictions wrong, it felt really good to have one that felt resoundingly correct. And that was that main event. We're going to talk about a couple other things from the main card. And then, in anticipation of the handies, I think we might do a bit of a downer, cynical look back at the year. I feel like it was a year of, I've reached the point in my fandom where I'm just starting to see my all-time favorites. Some of the fighters I admire and enjoy watching the most just, wash up. So I think that may be a discussion for the end of today's episode. But on that note, Frankie Edgar versus a Korean Zombie, it is starting to feel to me like, despite a really remarkable late career resurgence that I have a feeling will go underappreciated, will not deserve get the respect it deserves, it is starting to feel like Frankie Edgar is probably running out of time as a fighter who can still contend in the UFC. What do you think, Phil?
Yeah, I mean, if we look at the general direction of what he's trying to do, it is very hard to think. I mean, Frankie Edgar is not a fighter like Jose Aldo, where he is crippling his style if he goes down to bantamweight, and nor is he someone that I suspect would be particularly hurt by the cut. He's still a pretty small featherweight, as we saw today, but I mean, as we saw on the most recent event. But yeah, it's hard to see a path forward for Frankie's career that is a particularly positive one at this moment.
Yeah.
It's not going to be weight is not going to be a salvation. And we're now starting to see what happens with increasing regularity when he fights actually elite featherweights. And I don't think that's going to change much. At bantamweight, where the power he can bring to bear is higher and he's going to be able to grapple people more effectively, but the pace everyone keeps is way higher, and almost everyone in that division packs insane amounts of power.
Yep. Yeah, it's like the bantamweight's the perfect intersection between the power of the featherweights and the speed of the flyweights, so you just got a lot of shocking punchers. You know, like I always think of Ernie Shavers, or rather, who was it? Ron Lyle. He said of Ernie Shavers and George Foreman, I know I've said this on the show before, that George Foreman's power was a boom and Ernie Shavers' power was a bang. One is like getting hit by a shotgun shell, and the other is like getting hit by a gigantic semi-truck moving only 15 miles an hour, and they both kill you. Everyone at bantamweight has shotgun power. They just shock you with their speed, but they also hit hard enough to turn your lights off. And that's happening more and more to Frankie. I think the roteness of his style is not really favored by a diminishing speed either. I mean, what is there to say about this fight, really? I think
it's one of the rare fights where, we called it almost exactly just because the dynamics of the matchup looked so similar to ones which have caused Frankie to get horribly hurt before.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, not only so you could see Korean Zombie fight Dennis Bermudez and have some trouble tracking down his level changes and then finishing him off. You could see Brian Ortega do exactly the same thing to Frankie. And you could even go back to things like the Gray Maynard fights and just say, wow, this is a big, tough defensive grappler with a couple of nasty counterpunches. And that's kind of always been something which troubles Frankie. He needs to be the puncher if he's not the wrestler. He was able to make stuff work against Benson Henderson because Bendo was a kicker rather than a puncher. All he really had was his right hook.
Mm-hmm.
But just against big, powerful punchers who can wrestle, he's always struggled. And Korean Zombie was the best counterpuncher that he'd ever fought.
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, I think you raise a good point. Like, even Frankie Edgar at his best, if we had the Frankie Edgar who fought Gray Maynard and just gave him a slightly degraded chin, then this would have still been a predictable result. It's not all about is Frankie like slower or less technical or easier to read or whatever. Like, the man has always had a penchant for dipping into big right uppercuts. The man has always had a problem dealing with people who have the patience to stalk him, but just make him lead first. It was weird. Like, I'll probably offend some people by saying this, but what can you do with Frankie Edgar fans? Am I right? It looked a lot like Holly Holm versus Valentina Shevchenko. Like, Frankie's, as you said, if he can't be the wrestler, he needs to be the puncher. I think Frankie, like, he knows that in his heart. He knows that he fights that way, and his response to getting staggered with that first counter left hook that the Zombie hit him with was to, like, try to scare Korean Zombie off. He decided, like, he upped his aggression to decide to come in with more and longer combinations. And there's something to be said for, like, not having prefabricated combinations, for letting your punches go as the openings for those punches appear. That's how the Korean Zombie puts a combination together. And if you just have the patience to wait to throw those combinations, then Frankie Edgar is like, he can't help it. He's going to give you the openings. He's going to come in with several punches in a row. He's going to keep throwing, even though you're throwing. You know, I mean, it's like these guys are so similar in that regard. The Korean Zombie also will just fire through whatever you're throwing at him. But when you are the quicker, more powerful, and more organic puncher, it just makes all the difference. That clearly in these exchanges, Korean Zombie had the feel to place his shots, and Frankie Edgar is always doing a lot more guessing. So couldn't avoid the counters.
It was still a very good performance from Korean Zombie, though. I mean, not only did he counterpunch Frankie effectively, he did it with way more accuracy and without taking nearly as much damage as he even did against Bermudez. And Dennis Bermudez is an even more rote and sort of gear clashing fighter than Frankie is by, several orders of magnitude. But this was, clean, focused from Korean Zombie. He hurt Frankie twice on the feet and then took him down. And then, they went to the ground and he constantly piled on damage to the head. Frankie clearly never recovered. I think this was the other thing that was really noticeable in the Ortega fight, for example, as opposed to, say, the Maynard fight back in the day, or the Maynard fights where Frankie was hurt, is that when he was hurt in those fights, he got hurt very badly, but was constantly kind of in the fight. In nowadays, he gets hurt, and he's just kind of, it is pure willpower keeping up. He's clearly visibly done. He is not getting hurt repeatedly again and again. He is sort of constantly on the verge of unconsciousness. I don't know really how to put it better than that, but despite the fact that both those Maynard fights are horrific beatings, he rarely looks as absolutely shattered as he looked after Jung and Ortega hit him. But yeah, so we got to see like a few elements of Zombie's game, not just that he's able to stay on his feet way more when he's counterpunching now. He can throw, without compromising himself. He can finish people without compromising himself, without having to throw himself into anything. And that he's still got just a super nasty ground game.
Yeah, I kind of wish I often feel this way, but I kind of wish we'd hit upon that more as like a potential counter to what Frankie Edgar likes to do. Because it probably should have been said that like Korean Zombie is one of the best submission grapplers, just objectively as a flat statement, that Frankie Edgar has faced in some time. And like the man, he came to the back almost immediately when Frankie went to the ground. And like, I know Frankie was hurt. He was compromised, so maybe it's not a completely fair measurement, but who manages to keep both hooks in on Frankie Edgar while like posting to maintain position and repeatedly flattening him out, all while continuing to deliver like strong and accurate punches. Like that was a devastating control performance for as long as it was on the ground. And the moment Frankie escaped, he just got murdered. So like, I don't know. Are you aware, Phil?
And the moment he escaped, he was still, because he'd been getting punched the entire time, he was still, he had not recovered at all.
Are you aware? I mean, this may not surprise you because I know you've spoken to a Frankie Edgar fan or two in your time. There are people saying this was a bad stoppage. Which blows my fucking mind because how can you be a Frankie Edgar fan and want him to experience more of what you saw in this fight? I think the numbers were he was outlanded like 80-8 or something. It was a completely one-sided fight. And every exchange, Frankie Edgar got hurt. The entire time they spent on the ground, Korean Zombie was in control. Yeah, I mean, it was... We say this about lots of fights, but it was both a sort of a referendum on where Frankie Edgar is right now, but also a really strong showing from Korean Zombie. It shows what he does so well, and it feels good to have at least seen such a favorable style matchup for what it was beforehand, rather than most of 2019, which has been me not knowing what I'm looking at.
I don't think either of us has really covered ourselves in glory this year.
No, it's been a rough.
But yeah, it was notable that, if someone like Jeremy Stevens hurts Frankie Edgar, they might follow him to the ground a bit, but then their instinct is going to be to disengage, which would probably allow him to do things like work in on a single and start to recover. But yeah, just the fact that Korean Zombie was able to completely confidently stay on top of him for the entirety and put him into, borderline checkmate ground positions in a way that I don't think any one of the people that he's fought before was fairly instrumental, because he might still have been able to recover if he'd just been up against,
right.
If Zombie had literally just been a puncher. But yeah, I mean, I literally can't remember like Frankie Edgar ever getting badly out-grappled by anyone. I think the closest I can remember is the first Maynard fight, the one that people hate, despite the fact that it's actually really good. And even that, it's not like if you watch it, it's a reasonably competitive, fun fight where he just gives up a few takedowns.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that one's more that's more him suffering against a much larger and better credentialed wrestler. And still managing in a lot of to find himself in a lot of wrestling scrambles. Like, I've never seen him just stuck in a jiu-jitsu control position and held there like this. So it's like Korean Zombie and Brian Ortega may have been able to do that as well had he not just knocked Frankie out on the feet. But not a great sign for Frankie. That's all there is to say about that. All right, let's take a break. When we come back, last week we asked the question, is Aleksandr Rakic good? And this week, I don't really think we have a very satisfying answer, but there will be some things to say about his fight with Volkan Oezdemir. Also, Charles Jourdain knocked out the Korean Superboy Choi in his first fight back in the octagon since January of 2018. It's been almost 2 years away. I think Zane and I on the Vivisection last week were saying, it might be good for him, actually, because he was in some crazy wars, and it could be really good for him to take some time off. No. Go do your military service, Korean Superboy. Take more time off. It wasn't good. We'll talk about that after this.
Hey everybody, thanks for listening to this week's Heavy Hands. If you like what you hear, please consider pledging to support the podcast on Patreon. Patreon is basically continuous crowdfunding. You sign up to contribute a certain amount per month to help us with production costs and the like, and in return you get rewards ranging from a mention on the Heavy Hands website to a question or topic of your choice being discussed on the show. We have a lot more in the works to reward you for your help, and we appreciate every contribution. No amount is too small. Just head over to patreon.com and find how you can help out the only show dedicated to the finer points of face punching. Now let's get back to it.
So, it sucks. It's a crappy division. All right, let's talk about it. Hello.
Yep, let's do it.
Welcome back to Heavy Hands. We are talking about the co-main event, which, again, I'll introduce this the way I sort of previewed it just before the break. Last week, our main question regarding this fight was, how good is Aleksandr Rakic really? Is he, capital A, actually, capital G, good? Or is he just another light heavyweight also ran? Is he Johnny Walker, or is he... I don't know. I tried to think of someone who was like on the opposite end of that spectrum and was good, and then I just started to picture the light heavyweight rankings, and I heard Hello Darkness, My Old Friend playing. Phil, talk about this fight. Did Rakic look good or not? Because most people did think he won.
Yeah, I mean, the scoring itself was a little odd, but nothing that I found completely objectionable. But, so I think we've asked the question whether Rakic is good, and we have to answer that with, yes, absolutely he is, by the standards of the light heavyweight division.
I was waiting for that asterisk.
Yeah, because I think we can now see who he is, because I think that's always the question that I ask myself in these situations, is you want to figure out not necessarily... how someone fits in a linear ranking of fights in the division, because you can never really do that. You can never construct them into a single ladder and say this person's number 1, this person's number 2, because matchups and so on determine this kind of thing. So you want to be able to say, who is this person? What's their identity as a fighter? And he didn't really seem to have one apart from just kicks and weird stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we can now see a clearer identity for him, and it is Thiago Marreta Santos.
It's literally exactly what Thiago Santos does.
And Thiago Santos is the uncrowned light heavyweight champion.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, Aleksandr Rakic is as good as the light heavyweight champion.
He is championship caliber * for light heavyweight. Yeah,
exactly.
I mean, what our dear friend and most hated rival Zane Simon always says is that light heavyweight is a division defined by athleticism. Like at heavyweight, the things you need are like durability. Like that's the most important thing at heavyweight, and then like arguably stamina is the second most powerful attribute to have on your side in that division. At light heavyweight, this division is just run by freak athletes. So like people with completely dysfunctional, half-baked games like Thiago Santos can go a long way because it's just sort of the middle ground between middleweight, where everyone who fights there is pretty athletic, and heavyweight, where everyone's just a big, fat, slow idiot. So, like, just having raw athleticism will take you a long way at 205. And Aleksandr Rakic has that. Like, what I needed to see in this fight was, can he mold that into a style that takes advantage of his athleticism? And that's what we saw here. Was not, like, we knew he was very athletic. That's why we were saying, is he Johnny Walker? Because Johnny Walker also seems quite quick and dynamic and hits hard. But doesn't have much of a chin or powers of recoverability, and doesn't have the ability to turn that into a style that can function against top light heavyweights consistently. All that Rakic showed here, and again, by light heavyweight standards, a functional style or game plan or whatever, it can be very, very bare bones. All Rakic needed to show here, and what he did show, was the ability to move around, like just not engage recklessly at every opportunity, make the other guy chase you, and the ability to go insane selling out on very quick, very powerful counters in combination. That was basically his approach to this fight. And despite the fact that I think Volkan Oezdemir in so many ways is a much better fighter, a much better technician certainly than Aleksandr Rakic, it was enough that Rakic maybe should have got the nod here. Like, I agree, I don't think it was it certainly wasn't a blowout. Like, if you think Rakic deserved round 2, that was also the round in which his leg began to birth a strange extraterrestrial being, and like Volkan Oezdemir just chopped him down and made him look visibly hurt with that weapon over and over. But still, like, it was the discipline that impressed me here. He had the discipline to stick to a really sort of minimalist style that just takes full advantage of the fact that he is very quick and powerful.
Yeah, I mean, the basic thing was going to be, can he get off the cage? Because he's someone who wants a very, very long range and doesn't have the footwork to ensure that. And can he do so without being predictable? Mm-hmm. And he managed to do that. He's developed out, whereas before he was prone, much like Thiago Santos back against like David Branch or something like that. He was prone to kind of river dancing along the cage and just getting clocked. And this time he was slipping. He was changing the direction he was coming out at. He was throwing different strikes as he did it. These were not pretty strikes. Again, mm-hmm. This is all Marreta stuff, is that he was coming out just with big, like, morning star swings at the end of his arms, or just a lunging jab, which actually worked surprisingly well. Mm-hmm. And you could see it genuinely broke much of Oezdemir's counterpunching ability.
Yeah.
I mean, he barely got anything done apart from the low kicks, which is sort of an indictment. But
I agree.
But yeah, I mean, it was a good game plan. It made sense, and you can, as I said, like that game plan, that kind of approach, pretty much took Thiago Santos to a very close decision loss against the greatest light heavyweight of all time, and one who is, I would say, whilst he has more unbreakable confidence than Volkan Oezdemir does, I would say Jon Jones is a much worse pressure striker than Volkan Oezdemir.
Yeah, I would say so too. And doesn't have, the reach. Physical attributes mean so much at light heavyweight. One other thing I just wanted to mention before we move on. I can sense we're leaving this fight behind us, and I'm not at all upset about that. I was saying this during the break, but fights that in other divisions I would think of as like, ooh, well matched, good, a nice low simmer all throughout. That exact kind of matchup just results in something at light heavyweight that I don't really like looking at for too long. But just one more thing I think that was instrumental here. Again, Rakic showing that having these physical attributes and paring down his output to a few simple things works well for a guy like him in this division. He was very active with feints in this fight. I think that had a lot to do with Oezdemir's trepidation in closing the distance. Like Oezdemir was not like really, he didn't do much to jab his way into range. He didn't do a lot of feinting himself. And as you said, he had a really hard time countering anything that Rakic did to him. And I think that Rakic, like, feints pay huge dividends when you are quick enough to back them up at any moment. If you have a lot of natural speed, then feints are going to mean a lot more. They're very rewarding for a great athlete because the opponent can't really tell the difference between a feint and an actual strike. Yeah, it worked for him. It was a good approach, made sense. Let's move on. Korean Superboy.
I actually want to add something as well. Is that we mentioned the okayification of light heavyweight before, and that has had there have been some obvious steps backward occasionally. It's not something where it's just suddenly there's a surge of better fighters coming into the division, and suddenly it's going to be worth watching and good. But I think it's still worth pointing out that this is another fighter. Like I said, he's very now hard to separate out from someone like Thiago Santos. There's now a lot of guys that you could see. You might not necessarily see them beating Jon Jones, but you can certainly see them troubling him. Like, this happened to Ronda Rousey at women's bantamweight, but it happened very, very quickly. Is that suddenly, almost overnight, suddenly her game was horrendously outdated. And I suspect that there is a risk for Jon Jones that some point in the near future he actually loses his belt, and then he takes a bounce back fight, and then everyone has reached a kind of basic level of kickboxing and athleticism that allows them to it to not be the bounce back that he hopes. There is a chance that there are now several functional kickboxers in that division in various ways, shape, or form who could just do what Thiago Santos did.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think I'll co-sign that as well. I'll at least co-sign the idea that I think Jon Jones's first, his title loss it feels imminent to me. The state of the division right now, all it takes is if Rakic gets a fight with him, that's just a run back of the Thiago Santos fight, and Jones probably lost that. It was at least close enough that it really could have gone either way. So not at all a reliably winning matchup for Jon Jones. But there's also Jones Reyes, and I'm looking forward to us talking about that one when it rolls around. But that may even be the one. We may not have to wait for a guy like Rakic to get the matchup or Thiago Santos to get a rematch. Like Reyes may be the guy to beat Jones as well. There's just an increasing number of people who are especially good in the phase that John Jones has more and more confined himself to. And as he becomes a better striker, he is still not a particularly dangerous one compared to a lot of other light heavyweights. And as our friend Ed Gallo would argue, I think his wrestling has seriously diminished in the process. So, he's kind of painted himself into a corner. That being said, I have a hard time seeing it looking a lot like the Ronda Rousey fall, because at the very least, John Jones is tremendously durable. And while this is not heavyweight, that attribute does matter a lot at light heavyweight too. So,
yeah, I think my picturing of it is more him just being very convinced that he's a really good MMA fighter, and then just kind of looking around, and then maybe having a somewhat shocking realization that he might not actually be that good.
Or at least that good MMA fighter doesn't maybe mean what he thought it used to mean.
Yeah.
That the game is shifted around him. Yeah, I think a moment like that is definitely coming for Jones. So, even if the fights themselves are not all particularly pretty to watch, they have tremendous meaning for this division. So, I think light heavyweight's going to become a really interesting place in 2020, which is, I guess, a fairly optimistic prediction. Okay. Let's spare a few words then for the Korean Superboy. Of course, the Zombie had a tremendous triumph in the main event, but the Superboy did not. And it was a guy no one's ever heard of who beat him. Which is not to say I don't know who Charles Jourdain is, but I highly doubt whether a majority of, the majority of like casual-ish MMA fans had any idea who Charles Jourdain was before this night.
Yeah, this one definitely felt like a bit of an indictment on the Korean Superboy, because Charles Jourdain showed that he is incredibly tough and incredibly game, but at no point in this fight, including pretty much when he knocked down and knocked out the Korean Superboy, did he not look physically outclassed. Mm-hmm. The only things which saved him were, that he was very gritty, that he kept changing his angle of approach, and that the worse things got for Doo-Ho Choi, the more he just dialed in to just plodding forward and waiting for a counter right.
Mm-hmm. And I think Choi, like, I'm going to borrow a phrase of yours, Phil, but this felt like a fight that really sort of revealed how little granularity there is in his game. That, like, even when he was in control in the early stages of round one, that being said, like, the first few exchanges were 50-50 or losing for him. So it wasn't really till he hurt Jourdain that it became a fight that he was in charge of. And then Jourdain dropped him just before the end of the first round and pretty much had his way in round two. But even in that stretch after Jourdain was hurt, where Korean Zombie was walking him down, Jourdain was able to just skitter away constantly with, like, the ugliest possible defensive maneuvers. He was completely, like, falling out of his stance, crossing his feet, bouncing off the cage, swaying totally off balance. And, like, it's really just a pretty loaded up right hand. Like, you don't even have to worry about the jab that comes before it if you know what you're about against Doo-Ho Choi. And like that in those moments where he should have been finishing a hurt opponent, should have been keeping the pressure on, it became apparent that it was, for him, it was either a choice between selling out on big committed power shots or not doing anything because you're trying to keep the guy in front of you and he won't stop moving. Like, he didn't have any feints. He didn't have any, like, little measuring sticks to judge the distance. he didn't have all of these like implied offensive tools to keep the pressure on Jourdain while he was trying to line up the big right hand. He was just trying to line up the big right hand. And that gave Jourdain time to recover. And I don't know. Korean Superboy's never been particularly great at, well, I don't know if that's fair. He certainly had crazy scrappy fights in the past, but like, he doesn't really adapt. You know, he's not going to come out in round 2 after getting dropped and do something much different. He's just going to be a tireder, slower version of the guy who, barely won, if even round 1.
Yeah, like I said, this was one of those fights where you look at him and you think you might not ever be good. I mean, as in you might not ever fulfill your clear potential because he still has so many gifts.
Of course,
he's still tough. He's still very fast. He still hits incredibly hard. He has a knack for fighting, but we've seen fights where, admittedly, he's had a bit of a stylistic edge. Who was the guy? Rick Little. Who's the Rick Little protege that he beat up? That was his like one of his coming out parties.
Sam Cecilia?
Yeah, Sam Cecilia. I mean, admittedly, this is that's a bit of a layup. But the Thiago Tavares fight, he showed a much better jab. He showed a jab in that fight. What has happened?
Yeah.
He is looking like he is regressing badly. This was a Brandon Thatch type.
Yes.
Performance where you're just like, what has happened to this guy? He's getting to the UFC and he's visibly going backwards because his game is retreating in sort of fear. It's becoming more pared down and as a result way more useless.
Maybe that's the thing that happens.
So yeah, it was pretty worrying.
Maybe that's the thing that happens when the pressure is on the big stage, you know, like I stop wanting to experiment with new things and expand my skill set because then I expose myself to like being wrong or being worse at that thing than the other guy. Maybe that's the mindset. Of course, he did have a 2-year layoff before this as well. But I'm not sure. Do you think he looked better in the Jeremy Stevens fight, or was this about on a par with that?
I mean, they were both pretty similar, but, you know, one of them was against Jeremy Stevens and the other one was against, no offense, Charles Jourdain.
Mm-hmm.
But they were similar. He came out, he did okay, he hurt the guy, and then the guy figured him out and trashed him.
Yeah, not a great look. Layoff, pressure, there's all of these factors that could be responsible, but the material facts are that we would like to see this guy getting better, and instead he's getting worse. And that sucks. He's 28 years old. He already, I think, had his Korean military service forestalled. I don't know if he can do that again or what the situation is exactly, but it feels like, like Brandon Thatch. Maybe not quite so extreme, maybe against a better class of competition, but it kind of feels like the book has been written on the Korean Superboy at this point. So we'll see what his next fight, if he can change things up. I've certainly written fighters off before, and they have surprised me. And unlike someone like Frankie Edgar, who I also, read a eulogy for at the top of this episode, Korean Superboy, again, is 28 years old. There's still potential there, and he's still tremendously talented in a lot of athletic dimensions. So the possibilities are there, but it's not a great look for him. Charles Jourdain is not the kind of guy who should be beating him. So, all right, let's take a break. When we come back, we are going to...
Wait a minute. One more thing to mention.
Uh-huh.
We were talking about light heavyweight, and both there are... I never want people to oversell these things because, these divisions are awful. But I will say we saw a few green shoots for both light heavyweight and, shockingly enough, heavyweight on this card.
Mm-hmm.
Because we saw Dawn Jung knocking out Mike Rodriguez with... I mean, it didn't show a whole lot it showed that Mike Rodriguez is still defensively terrible, but it was a nice counterpunch. And we saw Cyril Gane looking actually pretty masterful against Tanner Boser.
Cyril Gane is a genuine heavyweight prospect. He has a lot of potential in that division. And yeah, Dong Jung, it was a more aggressive showing than we've seen from him in the past. He's at times shown like a real paucity of urgency, so that's a good look as well. So yeah, it's nice to be optimistic.
They'll never be good. Let's always qualify that. It's almost certain they will never be good, but one day they might be okay.
They might be better. And that's all. That's really all the best of us can hope for, isn't it? All right. Well, with that little silver lining out of the way, let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk briefly about the shit that depressed us about MMA this year. After this,
financial support is fantastic, but there are other, even easier ways to support Heavy Hands. Perhaps the best is by spreading the word. We know our fan base. You're all cool, popular people with serious social media presences. You're tastemakers and trendsetters. Okay, there are one or two of you that don't fit that description. You know who you are, but no matter what, you can always help us out by telling folks about the show. You can also give us a positive rating and review on iTunes and Stitcher, things like that. We rely on word of mouth and positive feedback to grow and improve, so thank you very much for your time and your help. Now, back to the show.
All right, we're back. We brought our cynicism with us. Phil is, as always, useful as the way it works for me, Phil, is there's a whole catalog of extremely disorganized information in my head, and when it's totally unnecessary or when it's adding to some point that somebody wishes I'd stopped making 5 minutes before, then I can just call out little random tidbits of information. But often, like when asked with a pointed question, I have to sit and think for quite a while before the pertinent stuff starts like floating up to the surface. Phil, on the other hand, has a remarkable ability to just retain things in a very categorical way. And so when asked, what were the most depressing things of 2019 in the sport of MMA? Phil wrote me a list that broke my heart and crushed my spirit, which I have to thank him for. Should I just read off all of these items? Because we're not going to get to all of them. But
yeah, let's just run through them.
Okay, why don't we just trade off back and forth, and we'll see if lag makes that a hilarious failure. Everything Jose Aldo.
Poirier Khabib.
Conor McGregor is a piece of shit.
Thiago Santos gets robbed, and his legs fall off, and we have to pretend John Jones is good.
Henry Cejudo is the best fighter in the world, apparently.
Gustafsson's triumphant return, Lamau.
LMAO. Max Holloway is shot already.
Robert Whittaker is shot already.
Cain Velasquez is back.
Yair KO's the Korean Zombie.
Overeem Rosenstruik was also a masterpiece of bad winning over good, to be honest. So that's just a real short selection of all of the really like depressing realizations MMA has given us this year. I think it would be wrong if we didn't start off talking about the first one, everything Jose Aldo. Like, god damn, it's been a rough year for Jose. I don't know. Let's do a little recap, shall we? Aldo lost his featherweight title to Max Holloway last year. I don't know if there are many things more depressing than having the same fight again, doing a lot of things in a markedly better way, and then even the Max Holloway loss, that shit was back in 2017. Doing things a markedly better way and then losing exactly the same way. I think the real kicker for Jose Aldo's 2019 is that he appeared to be on his way, possibly even back to a title shot, but was at least like tearing through contenders, and then lost two of the ugliest, I'm not even going to say that, the two ugliest fights of his entire career in a row in 2019. get completely shut out against Aleksandr Volkanovski, couldn't come up with a single solution, just sort of quietly lost 3 rounds to the guy who is now the featherweight champ. And then he moved down to bantamweight, and Marlon Moraes, I'm sorry, guys. Again, I know there are people saying it was like good or heartening somehow. It was the most non-Jose Aldo fight I could have ever imagined being produced by Jose Aldo.
Yep. It was just him steadily, doggedly marching Marlon Moraes down, who, whilst looking extremely worried, was still punching and kicking him repeatedly.
Yeah. Hey, I'd be worried if Jose Aldo were marching me down, but at least now I know I can hit him with a jab literally whenever I want as he's doing it. So that's good. That's definitely something that Jose Aldo did in his prime, was eat jabs to trade big, wild power shots over and over and over, and then lose a split decision. So yeah, I don't know how much more there is to say, but like Jose Aldo is my favorite fighter ever. He is, oh no, we lost Phil. He's very clearly, I'm just going to go on here. He is very clearly the featherweight GOAT, and certainly members of the vaping scooter gang would argue that he is the GOAT of all GOATs, literally the greatest MMA fighter of all time. He's that kind of legend, and yeah, just more pertinently, like he is very personally dear to me as a fighter that I have followed and admired for a long time. And now it is that time. I always knew it would be coming. MMA careers are always a downward arc that ends in tragedy. There is no avoiding it. But still, it's finally happened. Jose Aldo is officially a shell of himself. And I don't like it, folks. Not fun.
Hey, Connor.
Yes?
You remember who else always used to talk about how he was going to retire? And then he actually had just like a really long post-championship career where he was kind of bolstered by both his name and his defensive craftiness.
Who's that?
Anderson Silva.
Oh, no.
Anderson Silva, there's a good chance that Jose doesn't retire anytime soon. We get an Anderson Silva post-championship postscript to his career.
Well, it
just goes on, and he loses to Derek Brunson type people.
They're just going to match him up with Derek Brunson. Yeah, so who's that going to be? Let's prognosticate for a moment. Who's going to be the Derek Brunson that beats Jose Aldo? I'm going to say he's going to lose a fight to Douglas De Silva.
Ooh, yeah.
That's
a good one.
Whom I love, but like not a guy that should beat Jose Aldo. And this, of course, I'm obviously presupposing that he will stay at bantamweight because it makes no sense and is obviously terrible, and so that's the natural choice. And then after that, he
should go back up to featherweight. Yeah, back to featherweight, get knocked out by Josh Emmett.
No. Oh my God, you're right. No, I don't want that to happen. I don't. Oh.
All right, let's cover some more terrible things.
Okay, all right. Well, you did mention Anderson Silva, him getting knocked out by Jared Cannonier, but I guess that sort of fits into the same category. Why don't we go ahead and talk about one that we had very high hopes for that disappointed us in more ways than one. Second on the list, Poirier-Khabib. This was, I think on the one hand, I was probably a little hoping that Poirier would win. He's like, Khabib is not like a good guy by a lot of metrics. I guess like if you're like a Khabib stan listening, you might have gotten really upset about that, but like, it's fighting. Almost everyone is like an asshole or a piece of shit. And the point is that Dustin Poirier is pointedly not that. Like, devotes a lot of time to charity, always soft and well-spoken, soft-spoken, polite, just seems like a good guy. And his actions back up that impression. And so that was one disappointing angle for me for this fight. But then there was also the fact that I expected Poirier to do some things that might, in some universe, lead to him winning the matchup, and he didn't do any of those things.
Like jumping guillotines.
The really disappointing thing was not just that Poirier couldn't win, because that was always on the table. It was always a likely possibility. It was the fact that he didn't do anything that would have allowed him to win. His best moment in the fight was burning every ounce of energy in his body, swinging the ugliest shots he has thrown since round 4 of his fight with the Korean Zombie, like 5 years ago. It was such a regression and a reminder of just how profound the effect of a takedown threat can be on a striker.
Yeah, it was also...
Would you just repeat that? Just repeat that. Yeah, you're there.
So the other depressing thing was how much he seemed to accept it afterwards. He was just the people just like, what else do you think he could have done? And he's just made jokes, and he doesn't really seem like he just seems to be like, yeah, Khabib is just too much. Got no chance against him. Never mind.
Yeah. And like he could have, like the possibilities were really there. It was also like, I guess the good thing about all of these heartbreaks and disappointments is that we can take lessons away from them. And I feel like that fight also taught me something about the fight preparation at ATT that I hadn't fully pieced together before, and how they can get a little too, they can get some tactical tunnel vision. And obviously Khabib is a much better and more complicated fighter than Ronda Rousey, but it really felt like all of the pre-home Rousey opponents who spent the entirety of their camps training armbar defense. It was just like Dustin was also failed by his preparation in that fight. So the disappointment came from every angle. Well, what else? Do we want to talk about how Conor McGregor is a piece of shit? We've already upset the Khabib fans, or do we want to hit something else?
We can pretty much just leave that.
Okay, yeah.
But the good thing about that one, I think, is that it is at least multi-factor, because people might think that we were referring to specific legal matters, but there's so many to choose from, some of which are on record and some of which aren't. So,
and there's also
either way, he doesn't seem like a very nice person.
No, he's really not. And there's also just the undeniable truth that without like a high goal to chase, without like this underdog charm, McGregor's shtick is really tiresome. Like, has McGregor had a good line that everyone loves and remembers in the last 2 years? So,
very true.
Yeah. So even as an entertainment object, Conor McGregor, I think, has seriously fallen from grace. Thiago Santos got robbed against John Jones, Phil. That was a heartbreaking moment, not only because it revealed just how thin of a veneer John Jones's dominance really is, but also like Santos deserved that decision. And how fucking cool would it be if we had Thiago Santos as the reigning light heavyweight champion in the UFC? It would be an amazing time.
In some ways, this broke my, I have to say, because I really like Maheta. He just seems like a cool, soft-spoken, slightly crazy guy who, helps out kids, and like he seems like a somewhat, a bit like Massa and Duba in that way. He just seems like a good guy around the community and just a super hard worker. And he put on an incredibly brave performance when he's previously been someone who, and it's an incredibly unfortunate series of circumstances. And before, I think at the end of 2018, I said, all I want from 2019 is for Thiago Santos to wear John Jones unconscious. Tornado kick even. And it didn't happen. And that's all I wanted. It's all I wanted from light heavyweight. I just wanted him to get tornado kick.
Fuck you, Santa. Okay. I only asked for one thing.
I'm so sad.
And,
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I also have an affection for Thiago Santos. He seems like he does some stuff to support his community, but also, as you said, in every interview where he's talking about an opponent or what he expects to happen in a fight, he is also a maniac. He's like, well, I expect there to be lots and lots of delicious blood. I'm going to create violence on my enemy, and afterwards I will crack his bones and drink the marrow. And everyone's just like, good for you, Thiago. Thanks for the interview. So I'm glad that we still have him.
He's also apparently, though, just incredibly nice.
Yeah. He's someone who seems to have successfully, I mean, again, something will probably come out at some point. But as far as we can tell, he seems to have successfully contained his madness to the octagon.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, maybe this should be the last one. Well, okay. So who does the best fight in the world? I think that one speaks for itself. I actually want to talk about these two last, and then we'll wrap it. Max Holloway / Robert Whittaker is shot already. Do you think that's true, Phil? I don't want to believe that's true.
I think it's worth internalizing that as a possibility.
Can it just be that sometimes it's just a really bad style matchup for you? I mean, I don't know. I guess I'm more inclined to believe it for Whittaker because he got knocked out in a fight that was I don't know, just totally failed to adjust and just ran into the same thing until it finally ended his night. Max Holloway, I think, got really outsmarted by Volkanovski, but he didn't look shot to me. Is that fair to say?
Okay, when have you seen exposed like that at the UFC championship level and then come back to have a stable UFC championship run? Okay,
that's true. It's usually a bad sign for a champion when they get totally shut out of a fight. None of us are expecting Tyron Woodley to come back and reclaim the title after Kamaru Usman completely dominated him. And I think Volkanovski came about as close to dominating Max Holloway as anyone ever has.
When has it ever happened? How many UFC championship belts for any amount of time, with the exception of, Sarah GSP, which was a giant fluke?
Yeah. I guess you're right. The first thing I think of is Anderson Silva, Rich Franklin, and Rich Franklin didn't come back. Yeah.
So you were mentioning that one of the problems is one of the things that's depressing about recent MMA in some ways is that the people you grew up with are sort of becoming shot.
Yeah.
But it's also that 2019 was also the year where the people that we thought were their inheritors have almost all fallen flat on their faces. So, yay!
That's true. And I guess it does serve as a reminder of how great their predecessors were. That you don't just get to inherit being Anderson Silva or being Jose Aldo just because you can beat them. We've always known that to be the case. But yeah, it did feel like it took some truly great fighters to supplant those former legacies. In Whittaker's case, he didn't actually beat Anderson, but he certainly seemed with his incredible run through the division, beating guys no one thought he was supposed to beat, and of course his wars with Yoel Romero, that he was the fitting inheritor of the Anderson Silva reign. But it does feel too soon. That's why maybe it's just because I'm rejecting the reality before my face. I'm just not ready to say that they're shot. Maybe they won't come back and be the champs we thought they were. I think I can probably co-sign that at this point, that seems fairly unlikely. But also, I still have hope that Max Holloway and Robert Whittaker are going to have some good performances, are going to beat some top contenders and maybe get them each of themselves back to another title shot. That all seems likely enough.
Yeah. That is possible. They can have, Frankie Edgar careers.
Oh, no, you're right. Yeah. But that's all right. I can just become like a crazy Frankie Edgar fan. We're like,
why has no one ever called them Edgar Cranks or something?
Yeah, Cranky
Doesn't
Edgar.
make any sense.
Yeah, no.
Yeah.
It seems so obvious now that I've said it. Yeah, but I just can't wait for Robert Whittaker to get outstruck on volume by Jared Cannonier so that I can, like, go through all of the footage piece by piece and make a screenshot of every time some portion of his glove brushed Cannonier's face as an argument for why he deserved the decision. I'm looking forward to that future. So if that sounds good to you,
hell yes,
you should keep listening to Heavy Hands through 2020. We hope you guys enjoyed this Christmas episode. Again, we're working around unusual circumstances. Phil having an even worse connection than usual. Me being stressed to the point of my hair falling out with all of the holiday plans I'm trying to juggle. And if you knew how little I was really juggling, there are probably a lot of you out there who would think I was an absolute fool for even saying that. But what can I say? It's my lived experience, Phil, and I'll thank you for not invalidating it. That's it. That was most of 2019. It's done. It's behind us. Merry Christmas. Before the new year, we will be back with the 2019 handies. We can have a little more levity and a little more fun talking about the things that were genuinely great and the things that were so incredibly bad that we have no choice but to laugh about them. So look forward to that. Until then, enjoy your holidays if you are celebrating them. And if not, enjoy other people's holidays. At least they're not on the street, right? Have fun, and we'll talk to you guys soon. If you came here today for the finer points of face punching, you came to the right place. This has been Heavy Hands.
I don't want Joe Benavidez to get knocked out by Davison Figueiredo.
Don't say these things, Phil. We just got done with all the depressing shit.
But I don't want it to happen.
Me neither. So why even say it, you know? You just made sure it will.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You forgot to lighten everything by mentioning Usman Covington, by the way.
Oh, fuck. Okay, well, this is the outro. This is happening while the theme is playing out. Kamaru Usman knocked out Colby Covington. There is light in the world, and its name is Kamaru. Merry Christmas, motherfuckers.